The rotor blades were already screaming. The Black Hawk helicopter sat on the hospital rooftop helipad, shaking with raw mechanical fury, ready to lift, ready to carry 3 critically wounded soldiers to the trauma center 40 miles away. The flight paramedic was strapped in. The crew chief had his hand on the door latch. Every second on the ground was a second a man could bleed out. And then the pilot stopped. Captain Marcus Drell, 11 years of combat aviation behind him, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, a man who had flown through sandstorms and machine gun fire without flinching. He stopped the bird. He turned his head and looked back at the ground crew scrambling below. "Where is she?" he said into the radio. Calm. Absolute. The flight coordinator's voice crackled back. "Sir, we have a full team ready. We need to lift now. These men. Where is she?" Not a question anymore. The roof erupted. 3 senior flight medics looked at each other in disbelief. The hospital's trauma director, Dr. Gerald Hatch, a man who had not been contradicted in 14 years of running this unit, pressed his face against the glass of the observation window and watched with his jaw slowly dropping. None of them understood, because none of them had seen what the pilot had seen. And standing at the edge of the rooftop, half hidden behind a ventilation unit, clutching a small nylon medical bag to her chest and watching the chaos with quiet, dark eyes, was a woman nobody on that roof had ever taken seriously. Her name was Maya Reeves. She was 29 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. She wore her hair in a low bun so tight it looked painted on. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She moved through hallways like she was trying not to disturb the air. She ate lunch alone. She took every double shift anyone else refused without complaint. The other nurses called her Mouse. Not kindly. She had been at St. Carver Regional Medical for 8 months. She had no social media presence. She had never talked about her past. She deflected personal questions with a smile so small it barely qualified as one. She had arrived with clean references, a spotless nursing license, and nothing else. Nobody had ever thought to look deeper. They should have. Because right now, with 3 soldiers dying on a helicopter and a veteran combat pilot refusing to leave without her, the woman everyone called Mouse was the only person on that roof who already knew exactly what was about to happen, exactly what would go wrong, and exactly what it was going to take to save those men. But she didn't move yet. She waited. Because Maya Reeves had learned something that most people never figure out, that the most dangerous moment to step forward is before anyone is ready to let you. She waited until the pilot said it again. "Get me Maya Reeves, or I don't fly." And then she picked up her bag, and she walked toward the helicopter. What nobody on that rooftop knew, what would not become clear until the next 4 hours had stripped every assumption bare, was that the shy, quiet, apologetic woman they had spent 8 months ignoring had once done this job in conditions that would have broken every single one of them. This is her story. Maya Reeves grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee. If you know anything about Clarksville, you know it sits right outside Fort Campbell, home of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. The streets there grow up speaking a different language. Military time. Rank structure. The way a door closes when a deployment notice arrives. The silence at a kitchen table when a parent doesn't come home on schedule. Maya learned that language before she could read. Her father was a combat medic. Her uncle flew medevac. Her older brother enlisted at 18. She grew up surrounded by people who treated emergency as a baseline, who viewed chaos not as an exception but as the weather. She learned to read a room's danger before anyone said a word. She learned to move without noise. She learned that the loudest person in a crisis is almost never the most useful one. She was quiet because she had been trained to be. That distinction matters more than anything else in this story. At St. Carver Regional, the staff knew almost nothing about her. And what little they thought they knew, they had gotten wrong. They knew she was a nurse. Competent. Reliable. Boring, some said. She never pushed for the interesting cases. She never jockeyed for position during an incoming trauma. She took the charts nobody wanted, the overnight vitals rounds, the difficult families in the waiting room who needed someone patient enough to sit with them. What they hadn't noticed or hadn't thought to connect were the small things. The way her eyes changed the instant an emergency alert sounded over the PA system. Not fear. Not excitement. Something colder. Cleaner. The way a machine powers on. The way she always positioned herself near the exit during multi-patient events, not out of self-preservation, but because exits are also entrances, and she was always calculating flow. Her locker. Nobody had ever seen inside it. But one of the younger nurses, Priya, had borrowed Maya's stethoscope once and found it sitting on the top shelf of her open locker, and noticed, before Maya quietly closed the door, that the inside was organized with a precision that didn't belong to a civilian. Supplies sorted, labeled, redundant, everything in a specific sequence. Priya mentioned it once and forgot it because it seemed like a small thing. It wasn't a small thing. There was also the morning someone left a biohazard spill uncontained on the floor of Ward 3 in Maya, who had been passing through, sealed it, tagged it, and filed the correct incident report in less time than it took the charge nurse to find the right form. When the charge nurse asked how she had known the exact protocol, Maya just said, "I've done a lot of incident management." That could mean anything. It meant something specific. The hospital had a small gym in the basement, open to staff at any hour. Maya used it at 5 a.m. before her shifts. Nobody was ever there at 5 a.m., so nobody ever saw what she actually did there, which was not the elliptical or the treadmill. She ran sprints. She did movements that had names most nurses wouldn't recognize. She rehearsed scenarios in her head while her body executed physical drills with the economy of someone who had practiced them 10,000 times in real conditions. She also quietly kept a small notebook, pocket-sized, green cover. She wrote in it during breaks in handwriting so small it looked like encryption. If anyone had gotten close enough to read it, which no one ever had, they would have found not personal thoughts, not to-do lists, but clinical notations, case patterns, drug interaction edge cases, scenarios and their optimal responses. She was always studying. She just never told anyone what she was studying for. There was one more thing. The thing that, in retrospect, should have made everything obvious. On her second week at St. Carver, during a fire drill, the entire floor had evacuated staff, patients in wheelchairs, the whole organized chaos of a hospital drill. Maya had walked beside the charge nurse, helping steer a patient's gurney, calm as still water. And when the alarm had first sounded, that split second before anyone reacted, Maya had not flinched. Not even a little. She had simply looked up at the ceiling, located the source of the alarm with her eyes, assessed the nearest exit and begun moving, all within approximately 1 second, as if she had already known it was coming. Priya had seen it. She'd thought briefly that it was strange. Then she'd moved on. She would think about it again in about 8 months, standing on a rooftop in the dark, watching Maya Reeves do things that redefined what the word nurse was allowed to mean. St. Carver Regional Medical Center was not a small hospital. It had a Level 2 trauma designation, a rooftop helipad, and a flight medicine program that took enormous institutional pride in its reputation. The hospital sat 40 miles from the nearest military installation and had, over the past decade, developed a strong partnership with the Army, receiving combat-injured patients transferred from forward facilities, hosting training rotations for military medical personnel, and operating in a space that blurred, sometimes uncomfortably, between civilian healthcare and tactical medicine. The culture that had grown from this arrangement was particular. There were staff members who wore their military adjacency like a badge, who peppered their language with military terminology they had learned secondhand, who navigated the hospital's power structures with the same competitive seriousness that some people reserve for actual combat. The hierarchy was rigid, respected, or more precisely, enforced. At the top of the clinical food chain sat Dr. Gerald Hatch. Hatch was 61 years old. With silver hair he kept precisely trimmed and the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades being the most important person in every room he entered. He had trained at Johns Hopkins. He had published. He had consulted for 3 different hospital systems. He had opinions about everything and volume for all of them. He had never served in the military, but he ran the trauma unit of a hospital that served soldiers, which he had apparently decided was the next best thing. He ran it with efficiency and genuine competence, but also with an ego that left very little room for anything he hadn't approved in advance. His team knew his preferences. His shifts ran like theater. Everyone in their assigned role, following their assigned script, nobody improvising, nobody stepping outside the margins he had drawn. Maya existed outside those margins in ways she never announced and he had never noticed. Below Hatch, but not by much in her own estimation, sat head flight nurse coordinator Linda Ferris. Ferris had 15 years in the flight program. She was competent, exacting, and deeply territorial about her unit in the way that people become territorial when they have spent their careers carving out authority in a system that didn't offer it easily. Ferris had decided, in Maya's first week, that Maya was unimpressive. It had started with something small. Maya had corrected a medication calculation during a pre-flight briefing, quietly to Ferris directly, not in front of the team, not in a way designed to embarrass. She had simply said, "I think the conversion might be off. Do you want me to double-check?" And she had been right. The number was wrong. Ferris had thanked her in the moment, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and had spent the following 8 months making sure Maya understood the shape of her place in this unit. The flight assignments were Ferris's domain. Maya was never on them. Not because of competence. Ferris knew better than anyone that Maya's clinical reflexes were extraordinary. But because Maya had never asked to be included, never pushed, never networked, never brought coffee to the right people. And in the unspoken economy of a unit like this, those things counted. The younger staff took their cues from Ferris. Mouse had begun as a joke, whispered first by a tech named Danny, picked up quickly and never quite dropped. It wasn't vicious. It was dismissive, which can sometimes be worse. When Maya was assigned to a case, it was rarely the interesting cases. When she spoke in briefings, the conversation often moved on before her point had fully landed. Not because she was wrong, often because she was right in a way nobody wanted to engage with. She bore it without visible reaction, which, to the people around her, read as confirmation, as passivity, as proof that she was exactly what she appeared to be. One evening, 3 months before the day on the helipad, there had been a training simulation, a mass casualty tabletop exercise run by an outside contractor. The team was working through a complex multi-victim scenario. Hatch was facilitating, narrating the crisis in his methodical way, watching his team respond. It was going fine. Standard. Maya had been seated at the far end of the table, technically an observer. She hadn't been scheduled to participate. At some point, the scenario reached a branch point where the team's chosen intervention would, realistically, have resulted in the loss of a simulated patient. Nobody had caught it. Maya had raised her hand. Hatch had looked at her with the specific expression of a man who is about to be patient despite his preferences. She walked through the error, calmly, specifically, with a level of tactical medical granularity that made 2 of the senior flight medics lean forward in their chairs. There was a pause. Then Hatch said with extraordinary smoothness, "Thank you for that. We'll note that as an alternative approach," and moved on. Afterward, in the hallway, one of the senior medics, a man named Torres, had stopped her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Maya smiled her small smile. "I've worked some complicated cases," she said. Torres had watched her walk away. He had wanted to ask something else. He couldn't figure out what. He would figure it out later. Much later. On a rooftop. In the dark. It started 3 weeks before the helicopter. A transfer patient came in, a 24-year-old soldier named Corporal James Whitfield, medevaced from a training accident. Femur fracture, blood loss, but stabilized. Routine by St. Carver standards. He was assigned to Ward 6. Maya was on Ward 6 that night. She reviewed his chart. Then she reviewed it again. Then she went to the attending physician, not Hatch, a younger doctor named Dr. Ellison, and said quietly, "His pressure is dropping in a pattern that concerns me. It's within normal range right now, but the trajectory is wrong." Ellison looked at the chart. Numbers in range. He thanked her and moved on. Maya went back to Whitfield's room. She stayed near it. At 2 a.m., Whitfield went into hemorrhagic shock from an internal bleed that had been developing for 6 hours. Hidden. Slow. The kind of bleed that kills quietly. Maya was already at his door with a crash cart she had positioned there 2 hours earlier. They got him. Barely. Ellison, afterward, stood in the hallway looking shaken. He looked at Maya. "How did you know?" "Pressure pattern," she said. And his heart rate was compensating in a way that usually means the body is managing something the monitors aren't catching yet. Ellison stared at her. "That's a very specific thing to notice." She nodded, went back to her rounds. Nobody discussed it publicly. It went into a chart note and a near-miss report. But Torres had heard about it, and he started watching her. 2 weeks before the helicopter. Mass arrival, 5 vehicle accident victims from the highway. All hands on deck. Controlled pandemonium in the trauma bay. Maya was there, one of many, moving through the chaos without calling attention to herself. But Torres, pulling a patient's gurney, watched her work. She triaged visually before anyone spoke. She was at the most critical patient, the one who didn't look critical but was, before the triage nurse had finished the initial scan. She moved with a rhythm that didn't match her rank or her apparent experience level. It was too efficient, too sequenced, like someone running a checklist that existed only in their head. A checklist that was very, very long and had been memorized under very different conditions. He mentioned it to Ferris later. Ferris's response, "She's a decent nurse, Torres. Don't overthink it." Torres didn't say anything else, but he thought about it. 1 week before the helicopter, there was a patient, a retired veteran, 62, named Harold Sims. He had come in with what looked like a respiratory infection and had been triaged to general medicine. He was stable, managed, not a priority. Maya was passing his room on a medication round when she stopped, looked in the door, looked at the man. She went to the nursing station and pulled his chart. She read it. Then she went back to his room and sat in the chair beside his bed and asked him 3 questions. He answered them. She nodded. She went back to the nursing station and called the attending. "He has altitude sickness," she said. The attending almost laughed. "We're at sea level. He flew in from Denver 2 days ago. 72-hour delay in symptom presentation, very common in older patients. Check his oxygen saturation trend against his arrival time." A pause. The attending checked. She was right. By the time he came out of his office to ask her how she had caught it, she was already halfway down the hallway, pushing a medication cart. He stood there for a moment with the chart in his hand. He thought, who notices altitude sickness in a sea-level hospital? He didn't have an answer. 3 days before the helicopter, the pilot, Captain Drell, had come in for an aviation medical clearance check. Routine. He was passing through the administrative wing when he walked by Maya in the hallway. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other for 1 second that seemed to have its own weather system. Drell said, "Maya Reeves." And Maya said, "Captain." Not hello. Not I think we've met. Not any of the social cues that civilians use when they recognize someone. Just, Captain. Priya, who was walking behind Maya at that moment, saw it. She saw Drell's expression change into something she couldn't categorize. She saw him nod once very slowly with an expression of enormous respect and something else. Something that looked almost like relief. She saw Maya give a single nod back. And then they separated and walked in opposite directions, and neither of them said another word about it in front of anyone. Priya almost asked, then didn't. 3 days later, she would stand on the rooftop and wish she had asked every question she'd ever swallowed. Because something had passed between those 2 people in that hallway. Something enormous. Something that would not be understood until the helicopter engine was screaming and 3 men were bleeding and Captain Marcus Drell was refusing to take off without a woman everyone else had spent 8 months calling mouse. On a Thursday. 3 soldiers. Training exercise gone catastrophically wrong at a remote site 46 miles northeast of St. Carver. A live-fire coordination failure, the kind of accident that happens in the seam between simulation and reality, when someone's radio goes down at exactly the wrong moment. 2 men with blast injuries. One with a penetrating chest wound severe enough that the on-site medic had radioed ahead with a specific phrase that meant, "He will not survive the drive." The Black Hawk was prepped in 9 minutes. That was fast. That was the flight team doing what they trained to do. Hatch was in the building, had been finishing late paperwork, and he came down to the helipad bay with the energy of a man asserting his relevance to a situation. He started talking immediately, giving instructions about the transfer protocol, the receiving bay, the trauma team he wanted assembled. Good instincts, mostly. Standard procedure. Ferris was coordinating the flight team manifest. She had her 3 senior flight medics ready. The gear was loaded. She was moving with the efficient authority of someone who owned this space. Nobody had called Maya. Why would they? She was a floor nurse. Ward nurse. She wasn't on the flight rotation. She wasn't in the chain of command for this response. This was Ferris's event. This was the flight team's event. Maya wasn't even supposed to be on shift. She had come back to retrieve a notebook she'd left in her locker. She was passing the stairwell to the roof when she heard the dispatch call repeat over the intercom. She stopped. She listened to the injury report, the blast patterns, the chest wound description, and something in her face went very still. She didn't run. She walked, but walked the way a current moves underwater, fast below the surface, to her locker. She opened it. She pulled out a small nylon bag she always kept there, zippered, packed. She had never explained to anyone why she kept it there. She took the stairs to the roof. She emerged into the roar of the Black Hawk's warming rotors and the organized chaos of a flight team preparing to launch. Nobody looked at her. Nobody registered her presence. She was mouse. She was background. She positioned herself at the edge of the pad and she watched. She watched the team loading the equipment. She watched the flight medic check the airway kit. She watched the gear arrangement. She watched the way the crew chief logged the manifest. And she saw it. Not all at once. In pieces. The way someone reads a language others don't know exists. The airway kit they had loaded was configured for standard civilian blast trauma. Correct for almost any scenario they would encounter. But the radio report had included 3 words in the medic's casualty description. 3 words that Ferris's team had not been trained to weight the way Maya weighted them, that told her the chest wound was not a standard penetrating injury. It was a specific pattern, a specific depth, a specific likely complication that would present not at the scene but at approximately 11 to 14 minutes into a 46-minute flight. At that moment, with that equipment configuration, the patient would die in the air. She processed this in approximately 4 seconds. She walked toward Ferris. Linda. Her voice was quiet. It was always quiet. The chest wound. The radio report used the phrase, displaced resonance on left field. That's tension pneumothorax developing. Your needle decompression kit is in the secondary bag. In a Black Hawk at altitude with rotor vibration, by the time someone goes for the secondary bag, Ferris turned and looked at her with an expression calibrated for interruption. Maya, we are 60 seconds from liftoff. You are not on this manifest. Please step back. I know, but if you reconfigure the primary kit to step back. Ferris's voice dropped to a register she used for situations that required no further discussion. Now, Maya stepped back. She stood at the edge of the pad. The crew chief was sealing the cargo door. The flight medic was strapping in. And then Captain Marcus Drell, through the cockpit glass, turned his head. He scanned the rooftop the way pilots scan, systematically, completely, and he found her. He keyed his radio. Hold. 1 word. Absolute authority. The crew chief stopped. Ferris turned. Captain, we are ready to. Where is Maya Reeves? Silence. Every person on the roof looked at each other. Ferris's face went through several rapid calculations. She's a floor nurse, Captain. She's not assigned to this. I know who she is. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. I need her on this aircraft. Non-negotiable. Hatch's voice came over the ground radio now. He had been watching from the observation bay. Captain Drell, your flight team is certified and ready. We need to move. Every second. Every second I spend on this pad is because you don't have the right person in the air. Drell's voice was steel wrapped in absolute calm. Get me Maya Reeves or I don't fly. The rooftop went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the volume of the rotors. Every head turned. And Maya was already moving. She didn't look at Ferris. She didn't look at the ground radio where Hatch was presumably preparing to say something important. She walked toward the helicopter door with her nylon bag and she said, to the crew chief, I'll need access to the primary kit once we're airborne, and someone needs to radio the on-site medic and ask him to confirm laterality on the wound. The crew chief stared at her. Then he opened the door. Ferris called after her, Maya, you do not have clearance to. Maya looked back once. I'll file the paperwork when we land, she said. And she got on the helicopter. The Black Hawk lifted at 11:59 p.m. In the observation bay, Hatch was already on the phone, presumably with Aviation Command, presumably with someone who could explain why his authority had just been comprehensively disregarded by a man in a flight helmet and a woman everyone called Mouse. Ferris stood on the empty helipad and watched the aircraft lights disappear into the dark. Her face was a closed door. Torres stood next to her. Who is she? He said. Not to Ferris. To the night sky. He would get his answer in 4 hours, from a source nobody expected. It started with the crew chief. His name was Staff Sergeant Elijah Rourke, and he had been on medevac aircraft for 7 years. He had worked with the best flight medics in the Army's inventory. He knew the difference between someone who was trained and someone who was forged. When Maya opened her bag on the aircraft, he watched her hands. She pulled out items he recognized, but arranged in a sequence he had only ever seen used in one specific operational context. Combat search and rescue. The kit configuration, the order of access, the redundancy built into her personal supply load, it was CSAR. It was the kit of someone who had worked in denied areas, in austere environments, in situations where the nearest backup was a radio call and a prayer. He leaned forward. "Where'd you serve?" he asked, loud enough to cut through the rotor noise. Maya glanced at him. "Army Medical Department." "What unit?" A pause. "Just long enough." 160th SOAR, she said. Rourke's expression changed completely. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers. The most elite aviation unit in the United States Army. The unit that supported Delta Force, that flew the Bin Laden raid, that operated in the darkest corners of every conflict for 50 years. Their flight medics, the ones who went on the birds, were not just medics. They were combat operators with medical licenses who had trained longer than most special forces candidates and served in conditions that most military personnel never saw the inside of. Rourke said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long?" 6 years. He sat back, looked at the cockpit, looked at Drell. Clicked. Drell hadn't recognized her from St. Carver. He had recognized her from before. From the places they had both been that don't appear on unclassified rosters. From the kind of operational history that gets kept in compartmented files and never discussed in hallways. He had known exactly who was standing in that corridor when he passed her. He had known exactly who was on the hospital staff. And when those 3 soldiers came in, when he heard the casualty report, when he understood the specificity of what was in the air on that flight path, he had made the only decision that made sense to him. Meanwhile, back at St. Carver, Torres had done something simple. He had Googled her name with a few additional search terms that had occurred to him: Maya Reeves, Army, flight medic. He didn't find much. The good ones never have a big footprint. But he found one thing. A letter published in a military medicine journal 3 years ago, cited in a peer-reviewed study on hemorrhagic shock management in austere environments. The citation listed a contributor who had provided field case data. CW to Maya Reeves, 160th SOAR, Fort Campbell, Tennessee. Chief Warrant Officer. He read the citation twice. Then he put his phone down and stood very still in the hospital hallway. He thought about 8 months of mouse. He thought about the training simulation, the altitude sickness, the soldier with the hidden bleed, the way her eyes changed when an alarm sounded, the notebook, the 5 a.m. drills, the locker organized like a forward operating base in miniature. He thought about every moment this woman had offered her knowledge quietly and been thanked and moved past. He thought about Linda Ferris telling him not to overthink it. He walked to the nursing station and stood there until someone looked up. "Does anyone know what Maya did before she came here?" he said. Silence. Priya said, slowly. She said she'd worked complicated cases. Torres laughed. It was not a happy sound. "Yeah," he said. "She has." He pulled up the journal citation on his phone and put it on the counter. Priya read it. Her face went white. "She was Night Stalkers?" she whispered. 6 years, Torres said. "Flying into places we don't officially go. Keeping alive the people who do the things we don't officially do." A longer silence. "And we called her Mouse," Priya said. Torres looked at the ceiling. "Yeah," he said. "We did." At 12:22 a.m., 23 minutes into the flight, the critical patient's oxygen saturation dropped. Fast. The flight medic went for the secondary bag. His hands were fast and trained. Maya was faster. She had already repositioned. She had already identified the landmarks. She had already opened the correct instrument from her personal kit, a needle decompression setup she had reconfigured for high-vibration airborne use, with a stabilization grip that wasn't standard issue but that she had designed herself after a near-miss in a different country, in a different helicopter, over terrain that didn't have a name on any civilian map. 11 seconds. Needle in. Tension released. The sucking sound of trapped air escaping the chest cavity. The patient gasped, breathed, stabilized. The flight medic sat back. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from the pure adrenaline of watching someone work at a speed and precision level he had never personally witnessed in real time. How did you, he started. He'll need a chest tube on arrival, Maya said. Make sure the receiving team has a surgeon in the bay, not just in the building. In the bay. She was already documenting, already moving to the second patient. She worked in near silence for the remaining 23 minutes of the flight. When they landed, the receiving trauma team was waiting. They took the patients. They moved fast. The chest wound patient was in surgery within 4 minutes of landing. He survived. All 3 men survived. The trauma surgeon, afterward, asked the flight medic what had happened in the air. The flight medic thought about how to answer that. He said, "The right person was on the bird." Maya filed the paperwork herself when they landed. Complete. Correctly formatted. In the precise administrative structure used by the Army's Aviation Medicine Division, not the civilian hospital system, because that was the system she knew best and it was just easier. Dr. Hatch read it the next morning. He read it twice. He found her in the hallway before her shift started, and he stood in front of her, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Because Gerald Hatch was a man who had spent 40 years being the most important person in every room he entered, and he was standing in front of a woman who had spent 6 years being the most important person in rooms that don't officially exist, and he understood the difference. "Why didn't you tell us?" he finally said. Maya looked at him. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" He didn't answer, because they both knew the answer. Ferris never said mouse again. Nobody did. And in the break room, a week later, Priya found Maya eating lunch alone, same as always, and sat down across from her without asking permission. Maya looked up. Priya said, "I want to know everything." And for the first time in 8 months, Maya Reeves smiled. A real one. The kind that meant, finally. People walk past extraordinary humans every single day, in hallways, in break rooms, in the quiet corners of every workplace, and never think to ask what they carry. The quietest person in the room is not always the least powerful. Sometimes they're the one who learned that silence is the most efficient form of readiness. What would it have taken for you to see her sooner? And more importantly, is there someone in your life right now that you might be underestimating? Drop their name in the comments. Or just tell me, when did you realize someone around you was extraordinary? Because some people don't announce themselves. They just show up when it matters most.